the starting point here is what is the system that everybody wants and needs, and then it's a question of working out exactly how that could be achieved, with a lot of trade-offs in here and a lot of discussions to be had. And one of those is, of course, the alternative models to privately owned generation. Just before we pass over, Louise, though, I just wanted to ask about the sort of status of your work. So you said you were undertaking a model with Stellenbosch, which is sort of looking at municipal solutions for embedded generation. Is that then something that's coming out soon and is part of a kind of a wider system discussion, or just a little bit more on where that work is going?
It's a model that I'm developing with somebody that's also doing her PhD. So the model is a part of her PhD. So it's been a bit up and down, but we're hopeful to be testing it soon with a municipality using actual data. Yeah. So super. It's part of a larger body of work, but certainly the model will be shared. It's donor funded and it will be accessible. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Louise. Okay, now I'll introduce my own colleague, Richard Bridal. Richard, very interested to hear a little bit more about the report that Chido and you and others have been working on, and some of the main sort of findings from that. Over to you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm just going to share my screen. All right, so let's try that. Okay, hopefully you can see that. So it's my job today to talk through the findings of our recent report, Panel for All, that came out today. And our brief here was to imagine what kind of business models could be available for renewable energy in South Africa. So first, I'm going to touch as to why that might be desirable. So we had two key concerns that were problems with the current kind of private-led system. The first one is that deployment of renewables isn't happening at an adequate pace compared to the kind of requirements of climate change, or indeed the planned decommissioning of coal generation that's envisaged in the integrated resource plan. And the second is that the private-led model kind of tends to generate political opposition, either in the form of kind of from a perspective of a sort of rights-based approach to power, or other objections to private ownership. So community and publicly owned energy would address both of these concerns. It could accelerate the rollout, and it could also kind of overcome opposition to private ownership. So we wanted to see to what extent business models exist in other places that can be drawn on, and what we can learn from these. So first we looked for case studies. We've got 4 case studies I'm going to briefly touch upon. I'd also remind you that the case studies are kind of long and detailed and focus a lot on the politics of how transition happens. So in this short presentation, I'm just going to kind of briefly explain what they are and what we found. But I advise you to kind of look at the full report to understand in detail some of the nuances of it. And finally, we're going to assess these models for a South African political context and look at what we might take from this and how this might be incorporated in movements and kind of political projects that are going on today. So the first one I'd like to talk about briefly is that of Ørsted, which was originally known as Danish Oil and Natural Gas. It was actually known as several other things before that, but it was primarily a company that existed to produce oil and natural gas in the North Sea. And over a remarkable decade, it went from a company a state-owned company, I should say, that produced 85% of its energy from fossil fuels to 85% renewables in a decade. So it was a very striking case study of state-owned enterprise transition. And how it did it and the findings from that case study show that, for a start, there was political commitment in Denmark at the highest level, but also coupled with management support within Ørsted, or Dong Energy at the time, to develop a transition plan and to kind of and to kind of embed that transition plan throughout all levels of the organization. Clearly, when those kinds of transitions happen, that's very disruptive, and the staff, the unions and others all had concerns, and it was a combination of kind of very high level political commitment and management commitment that led that to happen. The plan was very detailed and very technical, and it required pretty major restructuring of the business. So that meant that mergers and acquisitions had to take place in order to bring the right skills into the company. It's the kind of technical skills that the company has changed over that decade very substantially. There was a lot of internal consultation. There was clear communication about what the plan was. When it was published in 2009, the transition plan kind of envisaged that the company was being turned on its head and would go from a fossil fuel company with a small unit that did renewables to a large renewable company that had a small legacy business in fossil fuels, and by now that's phased out completely. The photo here is of one of the wind farms that around the time that this happened, which was called the Walnut wind farm, and was one of the largest at the time wind farms in the world when it was built. And it was the development of or Ørsted's renewable unit developing kind of these very profitable and very competitive renewable projects, which drew on some of their existing expertise, that allowed the management to envisage that the company could be completely transitioned to a primarily renewable company. And the other key finding from that research is that once there was a viable business unit producing these very substantial projects, it became kind of possible to develop a transition plan around that. Until that existed, there wasn't the expertise within the company, and also it was very difficult to develop a vision of how things could be different if you didn't have a business model that was shown to work within the confines of your company. So next, I'm going to talk about municipal utilities in Germany, and this isn't just one example, it's kind of the movement in general. So there are 1,400 municipal utilities in Germany at the moment. So approximately 900 of those are active in the electricity market. And the number's actually been growing due to a trend towards recommunalization of electricity provision. What that has meant is that the big four utilities that are present in Germany they were producing and selling the vast majority, in fact 80% in the early 2000s of electricity production, and that's been falling over time, partly due to market reforms. So it's not just municipalities that have stepped in to increase the amount of electricity they provide, but also the ownership structure of renewables generally is meant there's more small ownership. There's more small kind of renewable companies. There's also more institutional ownership of renewable assets. And alongside that, municipalities have developed their own renewable projects. So what that case study finds is that municipalities are uniquely well positioned to work with local industry and kind of geographical factors that make certain projects viable, and that can mean things like district heating schemes that can be converted. There's a picture of a CHP plant there which is based on the Munich municipal utility at the top of the page. Those kind of projects are inherently local because they have to be, in order to get them to work, you have to have local heat consumers coupled with local electricity consumers, and that has to be developed with local industry to find the right sites. So the other factor was that one of the reasons why municipalities were kind of either expanding or entering into municipal generation was purely because there was a demand from their electorates. Because of democratic processes with local government, they found that it was a popular measure that the electorate wanted them to take. People like to feel connected to their electricity and like to have control. Another factor is that the fact that there was available low-cost finance for municipalities through the State Investment Bank, KfW. And another side note is that the long-term revenues that those projects have generated have been used to fund other public services, which is good for the municipalities and also the people who live in them. So next, I'll talk about a very different model, which is cooperatives. So, and I'm going to focus on the United Kingdom, although other countries have also kind of had cooperative movements. So the UK started using cooperatives for energy back in 1990s. Some of the first wind farms of any kind in the UK were developed by cooperatives, and many of the people involved in setting them up came out of the environmental movement. So some of them were from anti-nuclear campaigners who were looking to try and prove that other business models worked. And there are now around 300 active groups who've developed kind of several hundred projects between them, all at different scales. Some of them have been a kind of commercial scale wind. Some of them, others have been kind of very small scale microgeneration type projects. For a while, they received significant government backing, kind of firstly informally through the feed-in tariff process, which differentiated support by size of projects. So smaller projects got more money, and that made them viable. But then in recent years, a move towards very large-scale mega projects, particularly offshore wind, has reduced the funding available for the kinds of projects that cooperatives typically have developed, and that's led to the development of other business models. We see now people are trying to develop models where you take a share of a large project rather than owning outright a small project. And that's a way of trying to react to the changing political environment. So what you can find is that cooperatives act mainly for the benefit of their members. So they do have a social mission, but mainly they provide services to their members. They provide returns to their members who are kind of investors. So that remains barriers to entry. You have to buy in to be a member. So it doesn't provide a universal service. And as an indication of the kind of value for money, in terms of the money that goes in terms of support and what it does, there was a review between 2010 and 2015 that found that £7.4 million, which is about $10 million of feed-in tariff revenues, had generated more than 50 million of private investment, and that was generating 2.4 million a year of returns for members, 1.9 million annually from ongoing contracts, which is primarily in the local area, £2 million annually for community benefit funds, which was spent on local community projects, and quite impressively 39.1 million for local installation contracts. Cooperatives tend to be much more likely to procure their kind of ancillary services, electrical, civil engineering, construction locally, because they tend to be smaller, and also because they have a social mission. Finally, another kind of big movement has been public-private partnerships. Here we're talking about how this has worked in Morocco. So in Morocco in 2008, the National Energy Strategy was launched, which aimed to have 42% of energy from renewables in terms of capacity by 2020. To do that, they set up a public ownership body, which was tasked to develop and part-own a series of projects, including the first large-scale development, the 580 megawatt Walnut plant. There's now several phases of that project. Massen, which is the Moroccan Agency for Sustainable Energy, took an ownership stake in that, but they also raised a lot of money from development finance institutions and international finance institutions, showing that there's a real appetite for international investors to get involved in these projects. There were some problems with it, particularly around land rights. So this was done very centrally. A lot of public-private partnership projects tend to be very large-scale projects that aren't necessarily kind of driven by local demand or integrated with local kind of democratic structures. However, the big projects did create big jobs, and they had, in this particular project, there was 2,400 temporary jobs and 250 permanent jobs in that one solar thermal project. And it also showed that where there's significant ambition and government backing to particular kind of projects, international finance can be brought in to fund these projects. So to summarize this research, I kind of thought this raised a few key questions for South Africa. So the first one is that could the expansion of municipal owned generation lead to significant energy deployment? So is it simply a local small scale kind of movement, or is there or can you really generate scale for these movements? Can Eskom transition as Ørsted did? There's been much kind of speculation about the effectiveness or the role of the Just Transition Office in Eskom. I think there's a real opportunity for that to be at the head of the transition, maybe one day towards a sustainable utility. And that's a really appealing prospect, although it's certainly not without challenges. Cooperatives, can they respect social concerns and deliver a more accountable and democratic energy system? Is the cooperative model kind of, does it address the concerns of people who are concerned about privatization, or is it just simply another form of privatization? I think there's a real debate to be had there. And then finally, given the kind of concerns about private ownership, the need for investment to come from somewhere, and also the financial problems at Eskom, is some sort of national or large-scale public-private partnership the answer? So those are all open questions. I'll just, to run through what we found overall, and for South Africa in particular, that one of the first findings was that context matters immensely, and that all of these models are fine, but it's in applying them to the South African context that we have difficulties. So the ongoing unbundling, that was a catalyst in other countries to create the conditions to enable business models like municipal generation, as reforms did in Germany, for example. That was part of a liberalization that enabled some of those municipalities to step in. So also the reforms within Eskom, the concern of just transition, around just transition, the Just Transition Office could offer a pathway, and that could be politically supported and financially supported to one day lead to a clean energy utility. But one thing that is clear from the context is that given the position of Eskom in the South African electricity system, there can be no energy transition without an Eskom transition. So that has to be at the heart of transition in the sector. I also just wanted to briefly touch on delivering at scale and decentralized versus decentralized. So here's just a table showing the four models and some comments on to what extent does it can it be scaled? And most of these models can be scaled. So PPPs and state-owned enterprise transition are very big scale interventions. Municipal ownership and co-op probably less so. Municipal ownership can be delivered at scale, as we've seen in Germany, for example, but only if rolled out very widely. In terms of decentralized energy and centralized energy, PPPs and SOE transition are fundamentally about centralized renewable energy projects, and cooperatives and municipal ownership are fundamentally about decentralized renewable energy. So depending on where you think the future of energy lies, there needs to be a mix of those. I think it's quite attractive to hedge bets and recognize that probably the future includes some degree of centralized and some degree of, and an increasing role for decentralized power. So you need to kind of back a few horses in this race. Another key barrier that we identified is the politics is really important in the case studies. It was high level political buy-in that made these models kind of work, to the extent they did work. And vested interests to pursue other energy type state capture, and a lack of political will have been hallmarks of South Africa's electricity sector. There are signs that some of that's beginning to change, which is really positive. Peter mentioned the opening of the round 5 of the bid window, and that's very welcome to many in the industry, I'm sure. So despite that optimism, there remain real challenges for developing projects outside the REIPPPP. And securing high-level political buy-in for those business models, and and in particular for those that require real serious reform, remains a key challenge and one that I think the energy policy community has to take seriously. So finally, to conclude, given the two needs that we identified at the beginning, the need for decarbonisation and to retain a public ownership model in the sector, all four of these models have a lot to recommend them. There's a need for deeper political feasibility of these models, but that has to come from working with many groups, including government, unions and communities. And I think the other big question is around finance and the extent to which that other sources of finance can be brought in to invest, especially given the perilous state of the Eskom's finances. So I think I'll stop there and pass back to Peter so we can get into a discussion of some of these issues. So thank you very much for listening, everyone.
Thanks, Richard. I think that sets up the discussion very, very well. We've got four possible models here that have been used alternatively across the world: SOEs, municipals, utilities, cooperatives, and PPPs. There was a couple of questions for you as well, Richard, in the Q&A function. One was a clarification question. When you said that 85% of DONG was now renewable, what exactly does that mean? Is that by generation, by capacity, by business, and how does that relate to sort of the wider Denmark?
Yeah, so so that was specifically Dong Energy's kind of energy fleet themselves, not Denmark's. I believe, I'll check the number while we're going on, but I believe Denmark is something like 60% renewable off the top of my head, but it's certainly very high. And a very high proportion of that is wind. Some people say that is enabled because it's embedded in the kind of Northern European grid infrastructure, so it can export a lot of its power, and it has kind of symbiotic relationships with other countries. So Sweden and Norway both have a lot of hydropower, which can help to balance Danish wind generation. But I also believe that Dong Energy is now not developing any projects, and in fact Denmark isn't developing any oil and gas projects in the North Sea anymore. They announced recently that they would not issue any more licenses for oil and gas projects. So it's a really comprehensive transition that Dong Energy and Denmark in general have undergone.
Thank you, Richard. And the other question was if you could try and upload the slides by link or by file onto the chat function so people can get a copy. That would be much appreciated. Yeah,
I will do that if it is possible. Yes,
I'm sure you can. Okay, thank you, Richard, for going through the report. And I think it's now time to turn to our panelists, and I'd like to ask each of them for some initial views on what they think about these alternative models, any comments they have on the report, and which of those they think are most sort of scalable, and whether they've got a good future there in opposition or in partnership or whatever it might be with more private sector owned models as well. So first, maybe I could turn to you, and Toby Futi Ntuli. Again, I'll introduce you as the CEO of the South African Wind Energy Association, but also a previous director of the Green Industries department within the Department of Trade and Industry, where she was responsible for facilitating the development of local renewable energy manufacturing industry, which I think is also a very, very key driver. When that can happen, as that encourages stronger targets and stronger action in countries. So, and Tombi, thank you very much again for joining us, and we're very interested to hear your sort of initial reactions and thoughts.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for having me as part of the panel. So I can't turn my camera on, so I'll just go ahead. I think the point of departure is we are going through a protracted energy crisis, and it lands us in a situation where we have load shedding, and this now forces the country into a multifaceted transition. And I think all the speakers have mentioned the fact that this transition is driven by the need to decarbonize our power system, the need to decentralize, and most importantly, in the context of today's conversation, the democratization of the energy sector. And when we're going through this, it actually forces the changes because as customers become very frustrated with the ability to receive power from the national power utility, they get frustrated and they want to get out and do their own thing. And this now gives rise to an emerging concept called prosumers, which is the consumers of energy have literally become producers of their own power. And this changes the ownership model in the energy industry. Prosumers, obviously in different forms, there's industrial and commercial, there's residential, and under residential, we have individual customers who are putting up their own solar panels in their houses. We also see complexes putting up solar PV on their roofs and actually providing some kind of a mini grid where they can provide their own power while still connected to the grid. And then we have municipalities who now have been given a go-ahead to procure their own power from independent power producers. So coming from a centralized ownership model, this is a big change that we're going through, and it's bound to be met with some kind of resistance and also some challenges as we try to figure out how do we make this possible without this disruption actually forcing us down the path of a complete collapse of the power system. So, and this disruption, it actually forces the incumbents, which is Eskom and municipalities, to adapt and change the way they think about how power should be supplied to customers. When we saw a lot of customers coming off grid, putting up their own power, whether it's industrial customers signing private PPAs and getting power directly from IPPs, or individual households putting up their own solar panels to supply their own power. It's a kind of a wake-up call to the utility to say, if all our big customers will end up off the grid, then I think it was Louise who mentioned that it actually threatens the current state of cross-subsidization between the rich households and the poor households. So what is it that the utility needs to do to adapt to these changes? And I think that's the big thing, is we cannot say it can happen. We've seen, I think it was early this year, when Eskom actually said users of solar PV or own generation need to pay a capacity charge to Eskom for having access to the grid. And a lot of commentators were in support of that, in the sense that, yes, we might be going off grid, but we still need the grid as backup. But how do we do it in a sustainable way, in a way that is not seen as anti-competitive, in a way that actually allows customers the freedom, which enables the democratization that we're talking about. And it shouldn't be seen as trying to close the space for self-generation. The best case study I have seen in South Africa in terms of community ownership or community-owned renewable energy is the pilot project that I've seen in Stellenbosch in, I think it's Lindorf Eco Village, where they've put up solar panels and they actually have a trading system amongst the people who are within that mini grid, which is something awesome because it also brings in the question of digitization has enabled that to happen. Now, as customers connected to the same mini grid, we can trade power amongst each other. And that's the change that we are seeing. We need to then find ways to enable, the policy should enable those things to happen, of course, without threatening the health of the power system. The last point I want to make, Peter, is with regards to policy, that we've seen, especially in the past year, government was very active in terms of making the policy environment somewhat conducive to these changes. the determination for procurement of power, utility power through the REIPPPP program, municipalities be in good financial standing, being enabled to purchase their own power from IPPs, of course, within the limitations of the MFMA and the Municipal Systems Act. And we've also seen NERSA being allowed to process generation licenses for applications without necessarily needing to comply with the IRP. So all these changes are saying, I think government somewhat sees what is happening, and they are trying to adapt the policy so that we can enable these things to happen. So I think the short answer to your question is these models can actually coexist peacefully. We still need an Eskom, we still need a national grid. We still need independent power producers to generate power for the national power utility because they can finance it. We still need households to be able to produce their own power. We need to find a balance of how do we make sure that these models coexist and do not threaten the health of the power system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ntombi. I think it's an excellent analysis of what's going on and how there is a lot of change that's happening through various initiatives and the need, of course, to try and manage and plan that change rather than it to just be sort of to be too chaotic, and of course to include Eskom within that picture as well. One question I had back to you as well, which you didn't mention in your remarks, was about the sort of the capacity of the wind sector, which of course you know better than anybody, and also potentially the solar sector as well, to be able to develop projects and supply equipment. An example where the country where we work a lot is Indonesia, and there's a very weak supply chain for both equipment and project development in that country at the moment. There's just so little capacity and so little experience. Whereas I have the impression that within South Africa, there's a sort of lot of pent-up supply, if you like, of projects and technology that are available, if and when people are ready and have the capital to invest in them. Is that right, or how would you characterize it?
Yeah, that's quite correct, because if you look at the portfolio of projects that have been developed and are ready to bid, that is utility scale projects, I think the bidding round that's been announced, round 5, is going to be oversubscribed. And that's an indication of there is a lot of capacity within the country. I think the last 4 bidding rounds have been a good sort of learning ground to perfect this power supply through the REIPPPP program. When we talk to developers in the wind sector and the financial institutions, and we ask about, okay, we've been allocated this much capacity, which is 14 gigawatts. We need to build that as a sector over the next 10 years. Do we have sufficient capacity in terms of financial resources, in terms of skills, in terms of equipment and everything? And the answer I always get is, yes, we are ready. We have, the money is there. The only thing that could stand between us and supplying that capacity would be the policy conditions. And we see now that the policy conditions are much more conducive. And I think the sector is then ready to go ahead and deliver that capacity.
Super, that's great to hear. Thank you, Ntombi. And perhaps I could move now quickly on to Leila Mohammed Vederman, who is the Director of Sustainable Energy Markets in the city of Cape Town. And this is a new department. It was set up in 2017. It is aiming to facilitate energy security, energy diversification, and innovation, all in meeting the energy needs and reducing energy poverty for the city. The department has also been asked to manage the low carbon development path in Cape Town towards a carbon neutral 2050 commitment. And Leila's personal experience as well has seen her as a Director of Development and Operations at the South Africa Mainstream Renewable Power Development Organization, which has built a large quantity of projects in South Africa. So Leila, thank you very much for joining us today. There's obviously been a lot of discussion already from Ntombi and from Richard about the importance of the municipal sector And it'd be good to hear from you a little bit more about that, and about sort of your reactions about how these alternative models could come forward and could support the rollout of more renewable energy in South Africa. So floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Peter. I can echo a number of the sentiments of the other panelists so far. But from my perspective, I would say that there is a small but certainly significant role for municipalities to play in the renewable energy future of South Africa. There are challenges, constraints, and certainly benefits, which will be felt mostly by our local citizens. And the City of Cape Town intends to do what and influence where it can to move South Africa more securely into this more sustainable energy future. I want to maybe sketch for you what we're doing and the constraints we're facing, and how our role is limited. But again, I think it's significant in creating this new energy future in the country. As you said, Peter, the City of Cape Town's energy resilience and diversification goals, as well as its carbon neutral by 2050 ambition, creates the necessity for a suite of interventions to decarbonize our grid and increase the opportunities for energy security, particularly in the absence of our national utility providing a reliable electricity supply base supply based on sustainable sources. So in our bag of interventions on the supply side, we developed a tariff and a policy that enables citizens, businesses, and the municipality to put up their own rooftop solar PV systems, or it's called also distributed energy resources, smaller than 1 megawatts. And in the city right now, that totals to about between 50 megawatts and 80 megawatts. We're also developing a wheeling framework that enables renewable energy generators to use the city's grid to transact with an off-taker that wants green electricity. We're also in the process of developing an IPP tender program where the city will purchase renewable energy from energy projects located or embedded within our city's grid. These projects are small scale and could vary from between 5 and 40 megawatts, but on average probably 10 megawatts. And we're hoping to secure about 100 to 130 megawatts from this intervention. There's a potential for cooperative or community-owned projects to obviously bid into this process, if the price is right, it could be considered. The fourth leg of this suite of interventions is our large-scale IPP procurement program, which will enable the purchase of renewable energy from projects located outside of the city and wheeled across the national utility Eskom's network. We're hoping from our first round of this tender to yield in the region of 300 megawatts. And then we also attempting to develop our own renewable energy assets, primarily solar, and then with some waste to energy projects. And these will be in the region of about 10 megawatts, and we're hoping to add about 50 megawatts in total from our own generation. At this point, we're not including a REIPPPP approach, as mentioned in Richard's presentation. It is, in our assessment, a complex and expensive and very regulated modality that will just add time and costs to this implementation goal. Maybe some of the internal constraints to the development of our own generation assets based on my recent experience. I would say there are about 4 big areas that constrain us. There's space, there's cost, there's time to deliver, and then capacity and skills. So in terms of space, land is obviously a very contested issue, and it has competing demands within a city space. The initial city-owned land combined with the grid assessment that we completed in 2018 shows that we are unlikely to exceed the 50 to 70 megawatt mark of own solar generation. We might need to engage and assess the potential for projects on other state-owned land, but that also comes with its own complexities. Just to give you some context, 50 megawatts is only 1% of the energy we purchase from Eskom. Hence the requirement to diversify the options and have a mix of modalities, including purchasing from IPPs, having businesses and residents produce electricity off their rooftops, and then also our own build. In terms of the cost, there are many factors to consider. A 7 megawatt PV plant's initial capex could be in the region of 100 million rand. And the operating cost of the facility should also be considered. Now, in a municipal environment, the cost of procurement is a lot higher than in the private sector. I guess in any public sphere, you will find this. And we are obviously pushed to be risk averse. And so shifting the risk to another party, the IPP, for example, we would pay more upfront. Adding in socioeconomic criteria, as again advocated by many, adds to the overall cost, and these costs get passed on to our consumers. So there are obviously also competing needs in the city, and 100 million can do a lot in many meeting many other needs. So motivating for these funds, it's of this magnitude is difficult, and finding the funds, is difficult. And then what I found quite peculiar coming into a municipal environment from the private sector is that municipalities budgeting processes treats capex and opex separately. So motivating for a huge capex upfront to, for example, build a renewable energy facility, to reduce significant opex in later years, 10 years, and so on, is not easy. So you don't see, you can't convince the treasury of the municipality that this is necessarily the best way to go. In the issue of time to deliver, the compliance requirements for spending public money leads to extended time frames. So a plant built by the City of Cape Town, for example, is likely to take longer than the private sector. When it comes to the last constraint is the limited availability of in-house skills and capacity to tackle this new area. A new skill set is required, from renewable energy project development, understanding feasibility study development, and then as an owner of that asset, at the end of the day, the operation and maintenance of these specific technologies. Those skills do not exist in a municipality right now. And municipalities find it difficult to compete with the private sector when it comes to attracting those specific skills. So again, this leads to a constrained environment for the development of renewable energy at the municipal scale. But there certainly are benefits to owning renewable energy generation assets. We recently developed some scenarios to assess the cost of supply-side interventions to meet our 2050 target. And we compared a business as usual, which is reliance on Eskom as we do now, to an own build program, to an own build with significant energy efficiency interventions, to the proposed embedded IPP program, as well as a hybrid of own build and embedded IPP, and then the large scale IPP program may be similar to REIPP. And the primary outcome is that doing nothing is not an option. All of the interventions compare more favorably to the business as usual case over time, potentially saving the city between 30 and 44% of the base case scenario over the 30 to 40 year period. Obviously, the largest capex outlay is for our own build program, and we would assume the risk. The smallest capex outlay, at a third of that capex, is the large scale IPP program. But the best total cost of ownership, or if you incorporate the tariff cost, the O&M cost, and the cost of capital proved to be own build with energy efficiency interventions, followed closely by own build backed up by embedded IPPs. Just to give you some context, the bulk purchases from Eskom to the city is the second biggest component of the city's operating budget at about 24%. So I'm not going to talk about the regulatory challenges that we face, but I would just maybe say that it's a new undertaking by the National Department and the Energy Regulator, and we're all learning, and there's not enough clear guidance on what is required or the timelines, but we are all in this together. So maybe in conclusion, I think that, like Ntomi said, you know, all have a role to play. Eskom, IPPs, Munichs, the residents, the businesses, we all have to find a balance to make this future work. And in that process, not jeopardize or put at risk the entire system that we so depend on for our livelihoods and our future. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Leila. It's absolutely fascinating, and so good to hear from, I guess your city is perhaps the leading city in South Africa at going down this pathway. I know you've had recent court cases and the ability to set up your own utility. And it was interesting what you said. I'm really pleased as well that you mentioned about the finances and about the sort of CapEx and OpEx issues, and that there were savings in moving down this model. But you started your intervention by saying there was a small but significant role for municipalities, yeah? And I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about what you think about replicability even outside the city of Cape Town into other municipalities who may not have even the same capacity and the same resources that you do. Do you see this as a trend that's going to grow over time, with municipalities taking sort of ever-growing shares of their own generation and control of their own sort of finances and social and environmental outcomes? Or is this going to be something that's slow, or is this going to sort of take off very quickly in some time in the future? What do you think?
That's a very good question, Peter. I think that there are a number of supporting platforms that are trying to encourage municipalities that are able to take up this opportunity to participate in it. And we are working with them to share our experiences, because I think that we will certainly also benefit if there is a momentum behind municipalities, and if municipalities can show that there is a role for them to play. So it's in all of our interest to make it work. I certainly see some of the biggest cities, especially those who have set themselves climate change goals, to get involved. So the 5 big metros are probably, are well on the path in trying to find solutions to this. They might not have all the skills on board. We are lucky in that our municipality has had seniors, politicians championing this area, and therefore we have had the allocation of some good staff and the opportunity to spend money in this area to make it work. But Peter, I do see a trend, but again, it will be limited to those that can. And there might be opportunities for smaller municipalities, but it will be a different model. Might be a model maybe actually more suited to a PPP approach than own generation or even a IPP procurement process. But I look forward to all the support that other municipalities and we are getting from within South Africa through National Treasury and others, as well as through international partners that have provided support. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Leila. And interesting as well to hear, one of Richard's comments in his presentation was about, there were 1,400 municipalities in Germany, and 900 of them had a position on electricity. So clearly there are hopefully some good experiences and advice that can come from outside as well. Good. Our last panelist today then is Richard Halsey. Richard works for an NGO, and they have called Project 90 by 2030. Their mission is to inspire and mobilize South African society towards a just energy transition in ways that mean that there's a big improvement in how South African communities and individuals interact with Earth systems by the year 2030. Richard, we're delighted to have you on the panel today, and also because we haven't really dug into the issue of sort of social and environmental concerns yet. I know the other panelists have got those very much in the forefront of their minds, but it'd be interesting to hear as well from you and from your position and from your membership, how you're feeling about these alternative models for electricity generation, and which of those could be scaled up and how quickly.
Great, thanks very much for the opportunity, Peter. Let's just apologize. The camera on my laptop is on the way out, and the neighbors have just started doing some building, so I'll do the best I can. There have been so many aspects touched on, and I know time is limited, so I just wanted to pull out a few. Firstly, to support one of the main findings of the report is that you've looked at 4 different models, and I definitely think all of them have a role to play, definitely. I think the encouraging bit about the Orsted example is that change within an SOE is possible. I know even just looking at the attendees on this call, there are different views on what should and shouldn't happen with Eskom, but there's often this view of, well, it's too big to fail, and sometimes, oh, it's too big to change. There's an inertia to just doing anything with Eskom, but looking at these positive examples that, yes, a big SOE can change is in itself important. And I think we should then work together as to how we rapidly change it and not get sort of stuck in a position of saying, oh, let's just leave it as it is because we can't do anything else. Leila's talked a lot about at the municipal level, so I won't talk too much about that, but just to agree that from the work we've done on just transition, a lot of it is about the local context, and municipalities are often best placed to deal with these issues. So certainly we agree that municipalities should play an increased role in the energy sector, and in particularly with generation. And it's great that the City of Cape Town in particular is pursuing this. I know there are hurdles, but I think it's definitely important. The PPPs have been touched on, and I think bid window 5 has just come out, and it has delivered renewable energy to this country, and it does need to continue in a way that at least we do get renewable energy up and running. But that isn't to say we can't learn from the lessons, and a lot of the lessons have related to how communities have been dealt with, and there's a lot that can be done on that front. Where I'd maybe like to spend a little bit more time is on the sort of community-owned renewable energy or cooperatives, as you've called it in the report. And an important observation we have noted is, because Project 90 has worked with both communities and with labor, and one of the refrains we hear a lot from the labor movement is, we're not against renewable energy, we are against privatization. And whether you agree with that or not is one thing, but I strongly feel that if the public ownership and the community ownership models are not given due consideration in the just transition, this is going to be problematic. There is a large proportion of people who are interested in these, and they need to be looked at. And as you've done in the report, and we have worked on another report, there are successful examples of where cooperatives and community-owned structures work well, and they often deliver more to the community than just energy. I mean, some of the examples we looked at that were in Brazil, Spain, and Mexico, there's increased transparency. Everyone in the cooperative can see all the financials, what's happening, and in some cases they have even subsidized electricity for poorer households. So there are a lot of benefits that come out of these models, and that obviously aligns with the just transition principles. But we also have to be practical and cognizant that in this country, they're only at the starting phase. As was mentioned earlier, I mean, there are some pilot projects, and that's the sort of stage we're at. And the trouble we have had, and we've done a few different just transition research projects, is you look at the the global north and first world countries, and as Richard mentioned about context matters, is you can't just cut and paste those. You know, we're going to have to work out in South Africa, how do we get this to function? But I think the important and the take-home message I would like to bring to this conversation is that these cooperatives and true community-owned modes do need consideration. They need to be looked at and taken seriously, and they need to be factored into this, you know, this suite of ownership models. And maybe as a last point, because I know I'm cognizant of time, is this tension of when to consider ownership. For a different research report recently, I was doing a whole lot of interviews, and I asked the ownership question, and a lot of the responses were, it's important, but we can't deal with it now. We just have to sort out, for climate change reasons, getting renewable energy on board, and with load shedding in South Africa, we just need to get the energy procured. And on one hand, that's true, but on the other hand, the problem is if you don't deal with this issue of ownership, you just get locked into the mode you're currently working in. So my counter argument to that is you need to start, and this is why I think it's great that ISD has also been working on this. We need to start tackling this issue of ownership, and as the other two panelists have said, how do we get these four different options to work together? Because there is a role for all of them. But you know, some need more help than others, and as some of the research we've done has shown, is that for community-owned ownership to thrive, there are a number of factors you need to consider, like finance and the rest. So yeah, hopefully all together we can embark on this voyage of assessing ownership in a practical way, and give support where it is needed to the different models. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And I think you've sort of reiterated this view that there are lots of that all the four alternative models are potentially needed now, plus the existing model of private sector ownership through the REIPPPP and through other techniques. But just to ask you, Richard, do you feel then, you know, if the market is going to be continued to dominate to some extent by reverse auctions for the near term, should there be some sort of carve out then for cooperative-based schemes, given how much, you know, other benefits they deliver as well? You know, should there be a tranche within the reverse auction specifically for cooperative schemes? Should there be government budgets? So, you know, what's the way to sort of fan the flames on the embers of the cooperative-based schemes, if you like?
Yeah, so I mean it's an important question, but a difficult one to answer. Like I'm not sure it can be factored into the reverse auction scheme currently. I don't know if it. I mean, so REIPPPP in itself has a community ownership component, but it's very small. I mean, it's sort of 2.5 to 5%, at least in the earlier bid windows. I'm not sure if window 5 is going to change enormously. So although there is a component of community ownership within the REIPPPP, it is not a community ownership program. I mean, so we need to be quite clear about that. And certainly, I think what is required is an acknowledgement of the role that community and owned models and cooperatives can play. And from that, identifying suitable levels of support. And this could tie in with municipalities, because, you know, a lot of we're talking about scale, your question right at the beginning of the webinar, which are scalable, but just the scale at which, you know, these community-owned things run at is most easily aligned with the municipalities where they are situated. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on this, and particularly around the sort of enabling financing of it. And you know, what we've observed in some of our research is that the feed-in tariffs were a way that got some community owned projects up and running overseas, but now there has subsequently been a bit of a move away from feed-in tariffs. So how do we do this? What do we, you know, there's some conversations around that, but I think just in terms of just transition, acknowledging that it is an important part, and that these benefits to communities are as not, if not more important than just the final price of, is the electricity cheap enough? Yep. And I know that was mentioned by one of the panelists earlier. I think it was Layla said, you know, if the price is right, it could be considered. And I completely understand that, but you know, there is more than just the price of the electrons. It's what other benefits do communities get? And that's something we should consider.
Thank you. And then a question just came through on the chat about crowdsourcing of funding. An example in South Africa being the Sun Exchange. Do you see some potential there?
Yeah, so I mean, I know the Sun Exchange has done good work, and there is definite, I think, opportunity for crowdsourcing to have a positive role. But my feeling is if you only rely on crowdsourcing, it's going to be quite limited in what will happen. I think if there is, I mean, in other countries, what they've done, if you look at some of the examples overseas, is that there has been a sort of state allocation of funding. So I think crowdsourcing is great, but I don't think we're going to get the level we need if we only rely on that. So a bit like our mixture of models, we need a mixture of support for cooperatives at various levels.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So I think a couple of issues that we haven't really got into in any particular depth so far in the discussion, and which have come up on the questions as well. One of them is around the issue that's just been raised by the last two comments about this resistance to private sector ownership. You know, how should we think about that in order to push forward the scale up of renewable energy? And the other one is about jobs, both the jobs that are available in the build out of renewable energy, and then the jobs that will progressively disappear from the fossil fuel sector side, particularly, of course, within the coal-fired power generation and mining sectors. So I'm not sure who might want to start from the panel here. Maybe Ntombi, we could start with you. What do you think about the issue? And I'm sure it's very close to you and your membership about this resistance to private sector ownership. You know, how should that be kind of overcome, if you like, or discussed, or somehow a solution found, given that it could just lock in the current system, which, you know, as we've heard from many of you today, isn't necessarily the best option going forward?
Peter, I think we need to look at it from the perspective of we are going to lose a lot of energy supply capacity over the next 10 years. And we need to replace that capacity, because if we don't, then we are going to stay in the situation we are in. And private sector putting together funds to actually fund rebuilding the power supply of the country, something that should be embraced by the public in general. And that's how I would encourage people to think of it, because if we don't encourage private sector to fund the rebuilding of our electricity capacity, then how else are we going to do it, especially in the context of Eskom's financial situation right now? So that's how I usually think of it. And of course, it's not a bad thing, because we must also think about how the REIPP program is structured. It's structured in a way that is very inclusive. It's inclusive in the sense that we've got a whole 30% of the evaluation criteria dedicated to economic development. And part of that economic development is local ownership at different levels, whether communities, whether Black, whether South African, and all of that. So that also contributes to the ownership discussion. And then on the issue of jobs, it's a very valid question. And I think the whole just transition debate that is currently going on is that it emanates from the are we going to lose jobs in the coal sector? Is renewables going to replace those jobs? And I can say that renewables creates a lot of jobs. We see it in the reports that come out of the REIPPPP office. But we also need to change the way we think about jobs, in a sense that we are used to people waking up every day for 30 years, going to the same site to a job. And in renewables, it's very distributed in nature, and it's also very distributed in terms of the value chain. So, but if you count up all those jobs in different sites, in different parts of the value chain, at country level, you find that it does offset to a particular extent the number of jobs that are lost. It may not replace the jobs in Mpumalanga, but at country level, definitely there is a lot of new jobs created.
Thank you, Ntombi. And Leila, same questions to you. What do you think about the private sector, resistance to private sector ownership, and also about the jobs question and this necessity that jobs are going to change in where they're located, how long they're available for, and how permanent they are also?
Thanks, Peter. On the jobs question, the reality is that in the city of Cape Town, even with our ambitions, we won't be creating that many jobs within the renewable energy sector. But within the value chain of this industry, that is where we should be trying to focus and increase the opportunities, bring in manufacturing, and that is what our provincial government and our city is trying to do, bring the manufacturing options to our region, bring in the consultancy people to our region to be able to provide the support to the renewable energy sector, but also creating local jobs that is within the full value chain. We don't have a coal base, so we haven't been impacted to the degree that other municipalities in Mpumalanga and Limpopo would be with the transition to renewables. And it is really, I think, important to consult and engage the municipalities of those areas, because they will be losing their revenue base and their a bundle of skills with the shift that we will see in the future. In terms of your other question, the opposition to private ownership, from my small little role that I play, the resistance I've heard is mainly around the sort of profits that the private sector gets from the participation in a sector that actually should be a service, and not driven by profits. And I think that like the IPP office and others have recognized that there was huge profits for the first couple of rounds of the REIPPPP window, and therefore they are relooking at how things are implemented. But I think it's a little bit of a tricky situation. I think it was Richard who called me out on this issue of whether we want low prices or whether we want participation of communities in the sector. And I think I've been clear that from our perspective, from a municipality perspective, the lower the price, the more we are able to provide a service to our citizens. And we have the difficult task of cross-subsidizing those that cannot pay. And if we have, like in the REIPPPP program, the addition of community ownership, in reality, those big corporations do not pay for it. We pay for it as the consumers of electricity at the end of the day. That cost just gets passed on to us. So maybe I'm rambling a bit because it's not my area, David. I mean, Peter. But I still think
it's always good to hear a municipality perspective, because you have so many goals that you have to try and deliver at the same time.
Yes. And energy poverty reduction is one of them. So just then in conclusion, Yeah, lowering the price of electricity is so key to the development of our economy. And, if we are able to do that, I think that we will be able to reach so many more people than just having a cooperative or a community project here or there, or a small participation of 2.5% by local stakeholders within those larger REIPP programs. Okay, thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Leila. Richard Halsey, any views as well, quickly on the sort of private sector ownership side or job side?
Yeah, so in terms of, I think sometimes it's the nuance that's important, and from our discussions with community and labor groups, one must be careful to not conflate privatization and just the private sector involvement. And a lot of this, I think, comes down to what Leila was just talking about as to where the profits go. And, we've definitely heard from labor repeatedly that, it's when all the money disappears to Spain or Denmark or wherever these big companies are located, that is the problem. This is not to say that the private sector doesn't have a role. I mean, they are going to be required to build these things for some of the technical services, all of that. It comes down to the ownership issue at the end of the day, and a lot of the, there's lots of definitions, but when it comes to, the community ownership side, it's just that they have voting rights in the project, they can exercise some sort of decision making, and that the benefits, whether they be profits or other benefits, go to the community. And that to me does not exclude the private sector. It's just, what role did the private sector play? And it's the same with the community. If you want to build a school or you want to build any infrastructure, that the private sector are required, but it's what happens once it is built. Where do the benefits go, and who gets to decide how it's managed and run? And I think this decision-making aspect of it is important in terms of jobs, because then it can be decided, who gets the jobs, how they are managed, and that kind of thing. And just a last point on the jobs is that, again, the 4 different models that we've talked about in your report offer different jobs in different areas. If you're looking for just numbers of jobs, that's where municipalities and SOEs have a role to play. If it's providing jobs in a specific location, particularly potentially a community in a rural area, that's where these other models can provide jobs that would just not be available if we're only limited to the larger scale kind of models. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Thank you, Richard. So I confidently said at the beginning of the webinar that we wouldn't go past the half hour. We're 1 minute past at the moment. My apologies for that. I think it's been a great conversation today, and I think the answer to the question of which of these alternative models is needed is all of them. And then we've spoken a lot about the sort of wider framework around the interactions with finances at municipal level and at Eskom level, the role of Eskom going forward. And it's clear that there's a role for everybody in this transition, and it's not sufficient that we sort of stop with where we are at the moment and sort of say, well, this is the best that can be done. There are too many barriers. We've got to let a number of flowers bloom here and push forward with as many of the different solutions as we can. I wanted to give the last word, though, to Louise Schultz. Louise, you gave us the opening remarks about the sort of where you saw the sector at the moment and the future of electricity in South Africa. I wonder if you had any sort of final reactions on sort of what needs to happen next, and what you sort of summarise from today's discussion. I'm sorry to drop that on you, but I find it too hard a job to do myself.
I can't believe you're doing this to me, and I was intending on jumping off for another Zoom call. Oh,
what do you think?
I think all the responses has actually highlighted the complexity of the challenge.
Yeah.
And it is a question, and I think we all have a ideological preference. And I think sometimes the challenge for us is, if we talk especially around ownership, it is to try and put maybe our ideological preference slightly on the back burner. Because co-ops offer many opportunities and much potential. Similarly, they can be enormous bones of contention and really sow division in communities that don't understand how co-ops work, for example. So I think I'm going to end off with what I started with. It is about conversations. It is ownership is an issue. And I think the challenge that we're facing in South Africa, and I think that Leila also alluded to that, is that the focus is so much, it's become so much around jobs within the just transition, that the ownership discussion, and Richard said the same thing, is being put on the back burner. And the two are not separate discussions. And similarly, and WWF is going to do some work with TIPS and GIZ on this, is this issue on jobs. And I think, and how we bring that realization about, I don't know, it's going to be challenging, but people have to realize there's a cold transition happening, that's happening regardless. And there's a renewable energy transition that is happening regardless. Those two are happening irrespective of whether we push renewable energy or want to support coal regardless. And once you've decided that, then it's how you phase out the one, how you support the other one. And of course, then there's all the related questions about how you enable value chains and unlock new industries and new manufacturing and all the rest of it. But next time you do this to me, you warn me.
Maybe, the unscripted comments are maybe the best, and that was a much better summary than I was going to give. So thank you very much, Louise. Thank you, and Tombi, sorry. Thank you, Leila. Thank you, Richard 1 and Richard 2. I think it's an excellent discussion. Please rely on ISD to stay very much involved in helping to push these solutions going forward, and in supporting the analysis, whether it be on subsidies or just transition or clean energy subsidy swaps or our energy policy tracker or Eskom reform or whatever else. And thank you all for your attention today. Sorry for going over the limit, and look forward to speaking to you all soon. So goodbye for now.